New malware attacking high-performance computing clusters.
So Jim, I understand there is a very particular piece of malware out there targeting supercomputer installations. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, this one was kind of interesting. The folks at ESET, which is an antivirus company, published a paper middle of last week sometime about this new malware that they had seen that they're calling Caballos. I'm probably mispronouncing it. And it's at the moment seems to be targeting primarily Linux systems, but it has the possibility of going wider than that because it's targeting OpenSSH. And there was the alert was put out by the European Grid Infrastructure CERT a week or so ago that the places where they've seen it in the wild so far have primarily been these high-performance computing clusters, these supercomputer clusters, and primarily in Europe. One of the interesting features of this malware is that it's really tight, compact code. It's a single function. It gets called recursively with different parameters to have it do different things. So it's complex to reverse engineer. In fact, the control flow graph in the We Live Security article is just really ugly. If anybody's done malware analysis looking at that control flow graph, it's not one I want to dig into at any time, anytime soon. But the interesting thing is, well, one of the other interesting factors is that apparently a simple command from the C2 server will turn any compromised systems into a new command and control server itself. Any compromised system that has has this Caballos software running on it can become a new command and control server for another, a subset of the bots that are out there. And the third interesting part is the way that it works. It opens up a backdoor that allows pretty much wide open access to the system. You can get access to the file system. Now, primarily the systems that have been infected with it, they've used it for stealing credentials. But since you've got wide open access to the file system, they could be used for a lot of other things. But the way it works is it looks for an incoming connection with a particular source port. And if you're using the correct source port, then it will open the tunnel back and allow you, wide open access to the system. So now the article says that it primarily has been embedding itself in the OpenSSH servers process, the SSHD process. It isn't clear to me how that it's linking into that, but if it is targeting that, OpenSSH now runs on not just Linux, but HPUX, AIX, and even Windows. Microsoft, I think in the middle of last year or so, finally officially released OpenSSH for Windows systems for servers and desktops. So I actually have, my forensic workstation in my office has OpenSSHD running on it, and I can SSH, from home on, when I connect into the work network via VPN, I can SSH in there. Now, granted, Windows is kind of hard to work with from the command line, but OpenSSH is not just for Linux anymore. Yeah, it's now pretty much any system that you can find on the internet, OpenSSHD can run on it. And so that's why the article makes the point that this could be, so far they've only seen it targeting Linux, but it could in fact target a whole host of other systems just because, if it's targeting SSH, OpenSSHD is now available for pretty much anything.
Well, what's interesting that I thought was that the only clear action that they had found so far with this particular campaign was credential theft. Is anyone that actually, connected into SSH, it would obtain their credentials and then be able to use those for propagation or other types of, offensive operations. So it'll be interesting to see how this develops, since it isn't terribly widespread at this point, and kind of what it morphs into and what the end game is, if you will, for this particular threat actor group.
Right, because the ones that they've seen, all that they've really seen is the credential stealing, and if they're seeing it mostly in these, computing clusters, these supercomputer clusters, that may not be all that surprising. That's primarily the big attacks they've seen on those systems in recent years were credential stealing. But the capabilities are there since you've got wide open access to the file system. You could do a whole slew of other uglier attacks than just credential stealing. So yeah, I agree though. We need to keep our eye on this one. And it isn't entirely clear to me how they got initial access into the system in these attacks. They didn't say that it was, exploiting any vulnerability in the OpenSSH server or anything. So I'm thinking that probably stealing credentials is how it's spreading at this point. Finding credentials that are used in multiple systems, because one of the few mitigation ideas that they suggest in the article is setting up two-factor authentication. So that suggests to me that it's spreading by the use of these stolen credentials. But it is definitely one that I want to dig into a little more. In fact, I'm hoping I'll be able to find a sample of it, even as ugly as that control flow graph is. I'm hoping to find a sample of it that I can throw into IDA or Ghidra and just poke around a little bit and see what it's capable of.
Yeah, but it's interesting, Jim. When you said high-performance cluster, the first thing came to my mind is coin mining, that's where they use this. But in the first paragraph itself, they make it clear it's not mining-based Linux malware. So that's the first that it came to me.
This particular one isn't. The recent attacks on the clusters, on the supercomputers, have been largely crypto mining because, hey, you got a whole bunch of compute power here. Yep. Why not? So yeah, that's what we've seen. That previous attacks against these supercomputers, these high-performance computing or HPC clusters, have been in the past, cryptocurrency miners, but so far this one hasn't been used for that.
In the past year, there's been a number of stories about offensive cyber operations targeting research organizations, particularly if they were involved to have anything to do with COVID-19 research, vaccination research, and things along those lines. So when you look at attacks that are targeting those types of high-performance computing clusters, coin mining from a monetization strategy is certainly, a tactic we've seen before. But intellectual property theft and, espionage kind of tend to fall closely on the heels of that, in my mind at least, as far as, threat actor goals and objectives.
That's where I'd expect them to go next, yeah.
Okay, Jim, one more thing is I think I've read, basically I tend to agree with what are your guesstimations you did. I think most probably they had stolen credentials for the SSL servers and they used to get into the infected systems, right? Then they dropped one executable SSD, maybe most likely compromised SSD. But I think you said that there's a specific source port that is what actually triggers the specific daemon, and that kind of does the secondary part, like propagating to the next victim, or maybe using it as a C2E, or maybe a scanner. Did I get it right?
Yeah, well, so this malware is just a generic backdoor server. And so to trigger the backdoor, you need to initiate in the cases that they describe here, an SSH connection with a particular source, from a particular source port. That would open the back door. So the SSH has to be publicly exposed, and then you connect to it. In this case, it says with a source port of 55201, and that would open up the backdoor connection, and you'd have unfettered, wide open access to the system. Now, of course, that particular source port is something that could be changed, in the source code of the malware. That's something really simple to modify. And perhaps, again, I haven't gotten a copy of the malware to look at. That might even be something that the C2 server could send a command to say, from now on, listen for incoming connections with a different source port.
Oh, that's interesting. I think that's why it's not easy to analyze. I believe even if one server can act as a C2, as like you said, maybe one server it can point to different server as a C2, right? I think that's one of the attack vectors. Also, third one I've seen is the same server can act as a proxy for additional victims. So basically, I think that's where it's not easy to determine what kind of capability, maybe function, the specific C2 or maybe IP is doing it.
Right, right. Because one of the other capabilities is that I'm glad you mentioned it, because I had kind of glossed over it and didn't mention it, is that it can serve as a proxy from other infected systems. So, other infected systems could redirect their traffic through this one and again hide their origin. So yeah, like I said, it looks like it has the potential to be kind of nasty. So far, as I said, they've only actually seen it doing credential stealing, and because it's this nice compact executable, it just has the single function, makes it kind of difficult to figure out what all the capabilities are. But yeah, one to keep an eye on. And like I said, I'm hoping I can get my hands on a sample here in the next week or two and get a little time to play with it and check it out and see what it's capable of.
I would like to see your analysis on that one, Jim. I'm interested too. Also, one more thing. Besides multi-factor authentication, like looking for that high-numbered port is a good indicator, Jim. That can vary.